Well, from the news, I guess we got to talk about tariffs. Sigh. But at some level, tariffs on coffee and wine and olives do provide some clear examples for what are the effects of tariffs sort of generally. So let's go with that. So we'll start with just the simplest, something like coffee. Around 98% of U.S. coffee consumption is imports. The U.S. grows very small amounts in the highlands of Hawaii and Puerto Rico and really tiny amounts in California. But it's all tiny enough we can just say it's approximately zero and just omit it entirely. Now, demand for coffee, as we've said, is relatively inelastic. People are addicted to caffeine. So that blue line has a steep slope, such that changes in price will not have really large effects on the quantity demanded. Of course, we talked earlier, there might be changes in composition of demand. People might substitute for lower quality beans, or they might not stop at their favorite shop and instead make it at home. But for now, we'll hide all those complications into just overall demand for generic coffee and say it's inelastic. The supply curve, on the other hand, is quite elastic. That's global, world supply. The U.S. is a large part of the global market for coffee, but there are plenty of other countries where people drink coffee. Now, a tariff would shift the supply curve upward by the amount of the tariff. If demand were perfectly inelastic, if it were an actual vertical line, then the price would shift up by exactly the amount of the tariff. Now, to the extent that people would choose to drink less coffee, the price would shift by a bit less than the tariff amount. Now, if demand were highly elastic, then the price wouldn't change hardly at all. In the limiting case, if demand were perfectly elastic and just a horizontal line, then the price would not change at all. Consumers would just buy a lot less. Probably what happens, though, like we said, to the extent that coffee is pretty inelastically demanded, then consumers are going to just pay a higher price by and large. Now, but note, the amount of money that the government would collect from the tariff depends on demand elasticity. To the extent that consumers don't much change their buying, the government will collect a lot of money in tariffs. Whereas if consumers dramatically shift the quantity that they buy, then the government would collect a lot less revenue. Next, consider the case where there is some domestic production. It's another more lines on the graph. The dark brown shows the domestic supply. The lighter brown line is the world supply. The blue, again, is demand curve. At equilibrium, the U.S. price settles where U.S. demand equals supply. Imports are the difference between total U.S. demand and the quantity domestically supplied. That green bracket there. This would be the case for something like the U.S. wine market or even olives. There's some amount of domestic production. Now again, we're smashing out a lot of subtleties in this graph. Certainly wine has a good deal of intricacy. Consumers have particular preferences about type and varietal, but on the other hand, there's also a good deal of commodity wine. Now next, this shows the effect of a tariff. Again, the world supply curve shifts upward, as seen by U.S. consumers, and prices rise, a bit less than the amount of the tariff, since consumers buy less at the higher price. But note at the other side, domestic production rises because of that tariff. Imports shrink from both directions. At a higher price, consumers want less, but also at a higher price, domestic producers are willing to supply more. Forecasting the new amount of imports after the tariff now requires both an estimate of demand elasticity, but also supply elasticity for domestic producers. Now, there are two sources of inefficiency here, shown by the two teal-colored triangles there. The one on the left is the inefficiency that domestic producers, who could not otherwise compete in the global market, are making this product. The triangle on the right is the inefficiency from consumers being deprived of the opportunity to buy this yummy product. Now, throughout this, I'm assuming we can talk about a tariff rate on a particular product and analyze how markets react to it. That is not what we currently have. Currently, tariffs are shifting drastically, day to day, despite policymakers promising that they would not change, which is destroying all credibility. Many of those imports come to the U.S. on a boat. They were loaded a while ago and they arrive in the future. Businesses made plans when they loaded the goods onto the boat, and those plans might be destroyed by the time the boat docks here. And that's been a regular theme from domestic businesses. While they have preferences about which policy might be better, having wildly variable policies is even worse. That seems to be the current approach by U.S. policymakers: wild variability. It's also the case that policy assesses different tariff rates depending on the source. So, for example, coffee beans from Colombia might face a different rate than beans from Guatemala or Honduras or Mexico. That gives incentives for transshipment. At one point, the policy was that imports from Nicaragua would face 18% tariff, while from Honduras, 10%. Those countries are right next to each other. There are obvious incentives for Nicaragua farmers to send beans to Honduras to be sent on to the U.S. Save some money. Ordinarily, there are rules about this, but the new policy did not include any of those details.